So,
All right.
my name is Val Leitner, and I'm with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. This oral history with Harvey Lillywhite is part of the Seahorse Key Marine Lab series, and this particular interview is for the Public Humanities Grant Series. So good morning, Harvey. How are you?
Good morning. I'm fine. It's fun to be here again and to be with you people.
We're really delighted to have you and to listen to your stories and all the things that you want to tell us about Seahorse Key. So your directorship of Seahorse Key began in 1998. Could you talk a little bit about your career prior to that and your areas of specialization and interest?
Sure. And first, I would just add that I'd like to thank you for enabling me to participate in the interview. I think this will be fun and hopefully informative. So
thank you. I know it will be both.
Okay. All right. So I'll try to be brief with part of the background here. But
yeah,
I got my PhD at UCLA. I did a postdoc at UC Berkeley. And then my first academic job was at the University of Kansas in Lawrence. I spent a while there. And then I came to the University of Florida in 1984. I was hired as a physiological ecologist, and the job was rather uniquely defined. First, it said they could hire senior people, and secondly, they preferred somebody who's specialized with amphibians and reptiles. So kind of a physiological, ecological herpetologist was more or less the definition of what they wanted. So I'll just say that my research interests are very broad. They have been actually since I was a small child. I love to go outdoors. I love nature. I like natural history. And I developed an early fascination with snakes. My early research career, however, mainly involved amphibians, and then later I got into a number of different projects involving snakes, and I worked in a number of areas that generally could be said to be in the realm of comparative physiology or physiological ecology. So the fun thing about what I have done and what I still do is there's a rich combination of being in the field, studying animals in their natural habitats, and identifying new questions or problems. And then we can bring questions into the laboratory where we can get quantitative answers and do experimental work. So I'm an experimental biologist as well as a field biologist. And I've had a long fascination with snakes. That was one of the reasons I initially became interested in Seahorse Key.
And so you became, thank you, and so then you became director of Seahorse Key in 1998.
1998.
And you were director until 2014?
I think it was actually around 2012.
Okay.
And there was an interim period where I sort of remained in an advisory role, probably as an associate director or something like that, when Brian Silliman became a director, and I think that was in 2012.
Okay.
So yeah, so that would be about 14 years.
So when you first began as director in 1998, tell us a little bit about how that happened, and if you can remember some of your first impressions with the directorship and your responsibilities and the island.
Okay. Historically, let me just begin by saying that Elo Pierce was the first director of the Marine Laboratory, and it was started around 1951-52. He became director in 1952. And then in 1970, Frank Maturo became director, and he was a director at the time that a task force was formed to discuss problems with Seahorse Key Marine Laboratory. And I think basically the idea was to try to identify some areas where improvements needed to be made. And at the time, the Elo Pierce, which the first director, but his name is also on a research vessel that was operating, and I believe it was in 1992, or around 1992, there were enough safety issues and needed repairs with that research vessel that it was taken out of commission. So the university said you cannot operate that boat. So they had this task force thing, and I think one of the things that was decided was, well, a director of a facility like this should not stay too long. So they wanted some new blood. Anyway, there was an opening for the directorship that came up while I was on the faculty, and at the time the zoology department. And so I knew a little bit about the island, but in fact I had not been here. And so I decided to apply. And what happened was I was brought over here on a boat ride, and I saw the island for the first time. All I knew about it before that was I'd heard all these stories about the numerous cottonmouths on the island. And I always thought, well, sometime I should go and see that. So anyway, when I came over on this boat trip, as a candidate for the directorship, I thought, as we approached the island, I thought, wow, this is an amazing place. It is such a beautiful place. There's a lot of rich mixtures, a mosaic of habitats. There's this 52-foot ridge, and surrounded by, Gulf water, and so it's just an amazing place. I didn't even see a snake the first trip, but so I was even then more enthused about the directorship. And so I can't remember the details of the search, but I was offered the directorship, so I took it. That was in 1998. And I would just say that it is one of the funnest as well as challenging positions that one could imagine in academic administration. So to me, it was, although there were many, many challenges, and we may talk about those later, but there was also a multitude of things to do that could be really interesting. And I decided from the very beginning that because the island was new to me, I could better plug myself into everything I was doing if I started a part of my research out here. So I and my students have been studying the cottonmouths and their relationship with the nesting birds for many years. And I won't go into detail about that, but I would just conclude by saying that the directorship was, in my mind, much, much funner than something like being a chair or a dean in an academic department. And of course, I got to come outdoors a lot, to be over here and to visit for administrative reasons as well as for research, and have a lot of fun, meet a lot of people. So that was, as I look back on it, that was really, I think, one of the neatest decisions I made during my career.
So when you think about when you think back about those really fun and enriching experiences being the director,
yeah.
What are some that stick out in your mind?
Okay, well, just every time I would drive from Gainesville, make the boat trip, come to this island, it was a special experience. And I came and visited with, sometimes I would meet groups that were here, either students or teachers or coastal training groups and things like that. There's all kinds of different people, and I would meet with them, sometimes give lectures or give little talks about things. And at other times I would come here with students, and I'd be involved in research projects. And sometimes I would come and meet other researchers who were here from outside the university as well as within the university, and I would kind of help them get started and so forth. And then there was my own research. So almost every trip that I can remember where I spent a little bit of time, especially with students, postdocs, other researchers, there was something amazingly special that happened. Sometimes it had to do with the birds. Sometimes it had to do with seeing an animal that we hadn't seen before and it was kind of unique to the island. Sometimes it was an event, such as there was one time I was walking along the beach. I think it was in the afternoon, as I recall. We were actually returning to up here. We had concluded a day of work. I don't remember what it was. And anyway, then all of a sudden I hear all this thrashing in the water, and what it was, there was a pod of porpoises right near the shoreline in shallow water. And I looked, and I could see a lot of them. The water was so shallow, their dorsal fins were above the water. And all of a sudden, all of the group, there were 20 or more porpoises. They started thrashing around. It became evident that there was also a school of fish there, probably mullet. And so there was all this thrashing, and it turned into a feeding frenzy. And it was right there in front of me, and I got to watch it. And so some of the porpoises would elevate themselves, or kind of jump out of the water. You could see some of them had fishes in their mouths, or they were catching fishes because the fishes were jumping as well. And there was this amazing thing that I just stood and watched for maybe 3 or 4 minutes. It was amazing. Other times, there were a lot of stories I could tell related to our work with Cottonmouth here. But I think almost every trip, we would go home and, we have a great story to tell. There'd be some fantastic thing or something new that we were able to experience during almost every trip to this special place.
Do you have any stories about working with the snakes or researching the snakes on the island? Is there any story that sticks out in your mind in particular that you'd like to relate?
Well, there are many, and I'm just doing this off my head. So
Sure.
Let me remember just a few. One of the first times I came over and I was with a group of students. These were undergraduates. There was a class. I think it was a class. Anyway, there was a group of students, and we started to walk into the hammock over here on this end of the lighthouse. And there used to be somewhat of a trail there. And actually, we extended the trail. We got permission from Fish and Wildlife Service. We extended that trail over to Gardner Point so we could walk and monitor and look at various things related to snakes. So one of the students was walking, and we had only gotten into the hammock perhaps 2 to 3 meters, and she stops. I was next to her. She said, "Is that one of your snakes?" And I looked down, and very camouflaged was a coiled eastern diamondback rattlesnake. And I said, "Whoa, that's not a cottonmouth. That's totally unexpected species. Stay well back." And what happened in subsequent years was that, especially I think during periods when there were drought years, I think eastern diamondback rattlesnakes would disperse from the mainland or Cedar Key, and any person owns a boat around Cedar Key probably has a story of one time when they saw a diamondback rattlesnake swimming in the Gulf waters. they readily enter water and they'll disperse that way. So although the cottonmouths are far more common, every once in a while an eastern diamondback rattlesnake would show up, and sometimes we found it, and it was always a surprise. One time I was walking up a trail over at Gardner Point. It was kind of an upslope thing, and I was with a graduate student whose name was Andy Rourke, and Andy and I were walking up this trail, and all of a sudden right in front of me here's a really good sized eastern diamondback rattlesnake crawling down, and we startled each other at the same time. I jumped back, Andy jumped back, the snake threw itself into a coil, started rattling, and then it crawled over into some bushes and coiled up and kept rattling for a long time. And it was a very large snake. And that was a total surprise. I'm always looking for snakes, so I'm not a person who steps on one, but if you walk around here, there are enough snakes, at least there used to be, that, you know, it's good to watch where you walk. So another story is, when I first came here, as I said, I was curious about the cottonmouths because they're a large number. And Charles Wharton, who was the only other person who he did a doctoral dissertation on the cottonmouths at Seahorse Key. Wrote several papers in the 1960s. I think he started his PhD work in the late 1950s. Back in those days, he came over here and he simply camped out. He spent, you know, weeks and weeks on this island, walking around, finding snakes, capturing them, marking them, counting them, and so on. And so at the time that he was on the island, he estimated that on the entire island there were about 600 snakes in total. And in our work, we think that's probably a little bit fuzzy either way, but that's probably a pretty good estimate. It is difficult to estimate accurately the number of cottonmouths because, for one thing, there's a lot of habitat where it's very dense. You cannot, it's almost impenetrable. There's snakes in there, but you can't go and find them and count them. Also, they're heterogeneously distributed. So in all the time that I've been here, you would find most snakes, and there would be the densest population on the west end of the island at Gardner Point. And the reason is that's because where all the colonial nesting birds are nested. So anywhere you'd have a nesting tree, like if this was a nesting tree and birds in it, when they would feed their young, they would sometimes drop fish, or if a young bird swallowed a fish that was too large, it would regurgitate it, and so all these fish come down. It's like manna from heaven. And the snakes scavenge on those fish. So you could find a rookery tree, you know, with nesting birds. And numerous times with my students, we'd see such a tree and we could count 6 or 7, sometimes as many as 8 cottonmouths just coiled under the tree. Then on the east end of the island where there's a lot of marsh, and the birds tend not to nest there, they're fewer. So you know, the population is kind of skewed toward the west end of the island, Gardner Point, where the birds were nesting. So one of the other experiences was merely the number of snakes that we would see. And when I first came here, I got off track a little bit because I was going to tell you, when I first started to come here and I'd heard about all these cottonmouths, and I came over in the daytime, you know, I kind of looked around a little bit, I didn't see any. And then maybe there's a second trip, very early coming here, it dawned on me and I figured it out. Well, okay, what you do is you wait until sunset, and right at dark, I mean, it's almost a magical short window. Right at dark, the cottonmouths emerge from wherever they're hiding, and they crawl around, they scavenge. I don't know what the reason is, but sometimes we could walk right around the lighthouse here and you'd find a snake that would come out after dark. It would just coil and just sit in the open like it was enjoying things. So anyway, the snakes are basically nocturnal. So there was one routine we did where we had transects along the beach, but near the ecotone between the open beach and the hammock, and there would be nesting trees with nesting birds, and the cottonmouths would come out and they'd crawl around there. So we'd walk along these transects, both west and east, and we'd count the number of snakes. Sometimes, depending on what the project was at the time, we would capture them and bring some back to the laboratory. We'd measure them. We would put pit tags in them to mark them. We could recapture them later, you know, which animal we had, and things like that. So anyway, sometimes walking one direction along the transect and back, say on the west end that goes down to Gardner Point, you know, we would see dozens of snakes. Absolutely amazing. And then, would you like me to continue the snake stories now? Because there's one more.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
really cool, I can tell you. Okay.
Okay, tell us.
This island population is, I think, unique in a number of respects. Out of all the snake research I've read, I don't know anything about what I'm going to tell you next. And that is that over the years we were working with these snakes, and usually at night, we would often see male and female pairs together, and not just during the mating season, which is spring, and then there's another one in the fall, but every month of the year we could see male and female pairs. We just refer to them as pairs, and sometimes you'd have a male, usually a bit larger than the female. They're sexually dimorphic. We'd have a male and a female, sometimes coiled right together. Usually some part of the body would be touching, or one would be overlying the other one a little bit. And that occurred even during periods when it wasn't the mating season. So, but these snakes would pair and move around together. Now, this I'm going to tell you, I'll get to in just a moment, but there was one year, Henry Coulter had me come over, and he had a person whose name I forget, but he was an old timer around here, and it turned out that this guy had worked with Charlie Wharton, and he used to be an assistant. He'd go out with Charles Wharton and they'd catch, you know, snakes, and he said Charlie would have like a big sack full of snakes that they were going to mark, and he'd be carrying them like this. So this guy knew a lot about what they did. And so he said to me, he said, well, at one point in our conversation, he said, you know, they pair for life, don't you? And I looked at him, and we had the impression that this could be possible, but, you know, a scientist is always skeptic, and so I tried to get evidence from him, hard evidence, you know, and he really couldn't demonstrate to a hard-nosed scientist that that's the case, but he said to me that they had some males and females that were marked, so they knew which ones they were, and they found them, you know, months or years later, and they were still together. Okay, well, anyway, the most amazing event I observed here to do with the snakes is the following. I'll try not to make it too long. I was with my students. We were walking along the beach near Gardner Point, and there was an open space on the beach where there was a tree like this, and there was this opening, and then there was a little bit of a slope into the hammock. And fortunately, there was a fallen tree. There was a big tree trunk that we could sit on, because we sat and we had a show. And the show was, we noticed just before we decided to sit and watch, we noticed that there was a large snake that turned out to be a male that was crawling down slope, and then behind it there was a second snake, which we later determined it was a male and a female. Now, the male was leading the female. When he would stop, she would stop. When he continued, she would continue. If he turned to the right, she'd turn to the right. So she was trailing right behind the male, which was a little bit larger. So we sit down, and I said, don't disturb the snake. We're just going to watch and see what happens. And so the next thing we notice is there's a second male, third snake. There's a second male that sneaks over and comes to either one of the two. And so the leading male, the male leading the female, would turn and crawl over to this other snake, which was smaller, lift its head, which is a dominance signal in a lot of snake species, and the smaller snake would turn around and crawl away real fast. So it's kind of like sometimes you call it a satellite or a sneaker male, right? Okay, so then the male will go back, and then the female is just waiting, and then they start to move together once again. Okay, so then a few minutes go by, and maybe from a different vantage place, that sneaker male comes back, and he comes over, and the male turns, does this, and he crawls away. And so we saw this 3 times, and then the little snake disappeared. We didn't see it after that. But the 3rd time, the male crawls back and turns around and goes over to the female. And the male and the female rise up like this. And this is almost in a posture that has to do with male-to-male combat. There's a ritualized behavior during the mating season where males, various snake species, will have a ritualized combat where they do a lot of pushing with the heads elevated, and usually what happens is it's often the larger snake of the two. The idea is for it to push the head down, and then the small snake becomes subordinate, and the other one gains dominance, and then the smaller one crawls away after that. But there may be a ritualized combat for quite a while. And then the snake that established dominance, usually there's a female around, and that snake gets a mate with a female. Okay, back to the pair though. This is a male and a female, not 2 males. So they go up like this, and they don't do the combat thing, but they touch each other's head a lot. And in particular, the male is tongue flicking all over the head of the female. And so we watch this. They do this for a few minutes. It's tongue flicking, touching the head, and then they come down together. The male goes in the front. The female is behind by 10 centimeters or so, not very much. And then they begin crawling together again. So I can conjecture, I don't know this for sure, this is speculation, but it's almost as though when that behavior occurred, they were establishing their some kind of bonding again, because these snakes were obviously moving, foraging together. Well, the way it ended was we were just sitting there watching, and the male crawls over and gets close to where we are all sitting on this log, and it becomes aware that we're there, and we're trying not to move much. We're just watching the snake. It's a large snake. We can tell it's a male. There are tail differences, and so there's male and female. The male comes over, lifts his head a little bit, looks at us, tongue flicks a few times. It was obvious that it knew we were there, and we just sat there. And then it was within maybe a meter. It's pretty close. And then it just slowly turns around and crawls into shrubbery, and the female follows it. So that was the most amazing thing. There was another time I saw a similar thing though, where a male was leading a female while they were foraging. And then there was a third time. Harry Green is a very well-known snake biologist. He was here visiting. We were walking around together. I was showing him cottonmouths at night, and I came upon a female snake that was swallowing a fish she was eating. And there was a male perfectly aligned along her back, lying over her on her back with his head 6 inches, 10 inches behind her head. and there was no competition for the fish. She was eating the fish. The male, it was as though the male was attending the female. They were probably a foraging pair like the other ones. The male was attending the female while she was eating the fish. So I called Harry over. He was some distance away. When Harry goes in the field, he has a big backpack, so he has all this gear, and of course he gets his camera out. He comes stumbling over, and just as he arrives, they are disturbed and they break up and they crawl away. So, you know, I told him about it. He got to see just a split moment of it. But anyway, so there were times when we'd observe male-female interactions that you normally never read about in other snake species. One last one real quickly. When young are born, and on this island, based on a good number of years when we made observations, every year it was almost always somewhere in the last week of August or the first week of September. The females that were gravid would give birth to young, and they don't lay eggs, they're born alive. And so there might be 6, 8, 9 baby cottonmouths, and they stay with the female for about a week. They remain with the female, and like she'll coil some secluded place, and the babies will coil in her coil. It's almost like parental care. I'm not sure that's what it is, but the babies stay with the female until they shed their skin for the first time. When they have the first ecdysis and the skin gets shed, then they disperse and they leave the female. So this is known in some other pit vipers, rattlesnakes, a number of rattlesnake species, for example. Same thing, babies stay with mom till the first ecdysis. Well, there was one female that we found in this situation, and I looked at it, we saw the babies, decided not to disturb them. We walked a little further and did some other things and came back, very short interval of time. Came back, I went and took a second look, and then I hadn't noticed before, there's a male with the female attending the young. And I've never heard of that before. So, you know, so these are just examples within just the realm of research with the cottonmouths that are rather amazing. You know, you drive home from here and you're just thinking, gee, wasn't that great, you know. So there have been a lot of research experiences like that, and we've published a number of papers. We still have quite a bit of data, including some of this behavioral stuff, which is unpublished. Some of it is going into a book chapter I'm writing, and we still have a few more papers that we're going to publish. So the snakes are pretty amazing.
Thank you so much for sharing those stories. Those
Yeah.
are amazing. And
Yeah.
so you are talking about those populations and this behavior as unique. So it's even unique for this population of cottonmouths as opposed to, for example, mainland cottonmouths. You wouldn't expect to see that behavior in cottonmouths anywhere else.
Well, I have to give you a fuzzy answer to that
Okay.
question. So being cautious about it, there are some other examples. Most of these are anecdotal, where other pit vipers, including copperheads, which are closely related to cottonmouths, and I'm trying to remember if there was one in a northern population of a different species of cottonmouth. Anyway, there are some other snakes, and they're all, to my knowledge, they're all pit vipers, where, you know, males and females have been found together. And so there could be, there's, if you put all the evidence together, and especially if you sit with a group of herpetologists and you tell stories, there's a picture that emerges that suggests there may well be some kind of bonding, pair bonding between males and females within vipaired snakes. But what we've observed here, I don't know of any examples and we've never observed anything like it on the mainland. I'm cautious though, because that doesn't mean that some secluded place, you know, that's maybe hard to get to, but where there are a lot of snakes because there are a lot of resources, maybe in South Florida someplace, you know, maybe there's another place where this occurs. But one could speculate that the reason it could be unique to this island is because of the nesting birds and the resources they provide in terms of drop fish, which the snakes eat. Because of that phenomenon, the population of cottonmouths here has grown to be quite large. So there are a lot of snakes, and they get to be quite large in body size as well. And they're relatively isolated because they're on this island. And so you have kind of in other words, kind of a restricted population with lots of individuals. So there could be selection there could be advantages for males and females once they get together to kind of, you know, keep the same mate. Now, I can also add, I know it's not an absolute thing though, because there was one time down by the laboratory, right near the building, I saw a large male, a smaller female, male and female pair, okay? And so, now I'm trying to remember what happened. I think we caught these snakes because I wanted to see if I could identify the individuals because we had them pit tagged. So I think we held the snake briefly, and then we released the male, and then about an hour later, we were doing something in the laboratory. About an hour later, we come out, and over to the side of the opening down there, I saw the same male. And it was with a female, once again, but it was a different female. So, so the bonding may not be like a sure thing, right? Yeah, there could be multiple exchanges, multiple matings perhaps. I mean, we don't really know a lot about the reproductive behaviors of the population, but I can just tell you that there are a lot of examples every month of the year when males and females are together, and I don't know of that occurring on the mainland, although it's possible.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask the other half of the directorship question, and then I'd like to move on more
Sure.
to the research and classes and curating the
Sure.
island. So you have so many wonderful, fun stories and enriching events that happened during your directorship. If you had to say maybe what was the largest challenge to you as a director, what might that be?
Okay. That's actually an easy one. It has to do with our continually garnering resources to run this place, okay? It's remote in a sense. You know, you have to have a boat to get here. So we have to operate a fleet of boats. That's expensive. You have to replace motors. You have to have maintenance every year, especially on the larger research vessel. And then we've talked on and off about solar power here. It's a little bit tricky though, because we cannot, for example, we can't put a lot of panels on the roof of the lighthouse because it's a historic structure, and I don't think the state would approve that. Other places, there's a lot of tree canopy that interferes, but we've talked about that. We did have solar lighting in terms of the post lamps for some period. But anyway, for a long time, the lighthouse is run by the electric, and the lighting is run by a generator. And the fire marshal says that if there's anybody staying in the lighthouse overnight, whether it's a small group of researchers or a class, we have to run the generator. And so that is expensive. So we have a lot of expenses. And we've always had sort of a limited budget. So we get an operating budget, and that would get spent out fairly quickly. We also, we got an operating budget from the university, in addition to which, there were fees that were charged to groups that would come do different things, have boat transportation over here, use the lighthouse and so on, use the facilities. And so those fees were collected, and so we had an account in the Division of Continuing Education. So we call it the DOCE account. So that was additional money that we had plus the other. Anyway, you add everything up, and there were still challenges. And so from time to time, you know, I'd have to basically go to the administration above me and beg for money, right? And usually, you know, we could get monies, especially if we had anything to do with safety, or like if we absolutely had to replace a motor on a boat because it didn't run properly without it and so forth. But there was also a lot of deferred maintenance, you know, that we were able to take care of in various ways. So, for example, the honeymoon period when I first became director was pretty good because what I negotiated was a research vessel, and that's a Discovery, because Elo Pierce, the earlier one, had been out of commission for about 9 years, something like that. And so we got a brand new research vessel. And then there was a problem with the seawall in the front, down by the dock, and it was bowing out, and it had to do partly with running water up here at the lighthouse and septic tanks and so on. I don't know what all the reasons were, but anyway, the seawall is becoming unsafe, and so we got monies, and the Fish and Wildlife Service or the Wildlife Refuge, I was able to get them to contribute some matching monies. So we replaced the seawall, we replaced the dock, and we had a research vessel. Okay. And then time goes on, you know, other things come up. Another time, we got excess money additional money that was a big help was I was able to get a grant from Florida Lighthouse Association. And so the university matched some money, and with that, we redid the roof. There was a lot of deferred maintenance to do with the lighthouse. The porch, you know, had loose boards and things like that. And up the turret had some unsafe planks, and those were replaced. So we shored up the lighthouse and gave it a new coat of painting and all that. So that was that grant. Anyway, I won't give you any more stories in detail, but basically, although the program's running, there are lots of activities going on, the research is going, and you know, everything is fun. Underneath it all, there's still, I'm always concerned, you know, are we going to run out of money? So it takes a substantial investment, and also that includes salaries of the people that work for us. We had minimal people that would help us. It wasn't a big crew, so we also had to get a lot of volunteers to do things. We had, like, the Boy Scouts would come, and we'd let them come if they had a beach cleanup, so they'd clean up the beach, things like that. But anyway, the other thing I want to add with this discussion, because it has to do with how an entity like the university or an administrative unit can view a place like this. It's remote. Most administrators haven't been here. We try to get them to come and visit, you know, but they have no idea how important it is to students, especially who come. They can be immersed in nature, wild nature, you know. Most of this island is a wilderness area by definition, and they can conduct research, you know, without worrying about traffic and noises and onlookers and all sorts of other things. And so it's a great experience. So I'll tell you one little story. It has to do with another field station, but Stanford University has a field station called Jasper Ridge, and it's kind of famous because of butterfly work that's been done there. But anyway, what they decided to do, all field stations face financial issues. Anyway, what they decided to do was to have all of their biology majors visit a field station, spend, I think it was 2 days, so maybe an overnight, you know. You take students, they go there, they spend a weekend, but they're in a field station. And when Stanford enacted that program, what they found was that subsequently the retention of majors in biology just shot way up. It was almost all the students stayed in the major because they loved that experience of going to the field station. And there are many, many stories and other people all around, like high school teachers, people who have been over here maybe as a student, and they had one field trip. And they always remember when they went to Seahorse Key, and it's in their brain, and it's just and it's a valued experience, and that affects people. It causes students to become interested in science. It causes students to continue education. They see the world in a different way, and so. A field station is very important, and the problem is, as a biologist, knowing the wonderful things that are here, the administrators don't know that, so they have, to them it's on paper and it's costing money, right? So that would be the main challenge. Always trying to, identify and accrue financial resources to operate a field station. And now, the last thing about that, we did apply for, we got some grants that would help with research, sometimes research connected and so forth. And there are grants available that have to do with improvements at field stations. But at the same time, I have to say that there are also things that, because it's a field station, because of this or that characteristic of it, the nature of it, there are a lot of things that can eliminate a lot of potential grants that one might apply for just because they won't fund things. So for example, if I said a granting agency or a foundation, well, we need an additional $30,000 to make repairs or to use as operating costs because our budget's running out this year. Typically, they'll turn around and say, your university is running the field station. They're supposed to do that. We'll give you money to, study the cottonmouths or something. But so that's probably the biggest challenge. Yeah.
So when you took over as director, did you have an idea of how you wanted to curate your time as director, your directorship of the island? So say, I think, I'm going to focus the island and its programs on students or K through 12, or, what decisions did you make about public exposure to the island and how it was going to be used?
Yeah, okay. That's a very good question. And in some ways it relates to the first part. The previous question. I had kind of a broad view of the island. And actually, beginning with Frank Maturo, when he was director, and then continuing, especially I think with me, we did not view this place merely as a subsidiary arm of, say, the zoology department. It's a university-wide facility. It is a facility that can be used by people all over the state of Florida. And I had even a bigger vision in that it's a globally important place. Okay, I won't go into it right now, but this location, this island, is probably one of the best places in the world to study a whole range of questions related to climate change. Just as an example. I think largely from the snake stuff, this field station has an international reputation. And so, you know, when I was director, people that came here, scientists from other countries, they would come, they'd want to visit and so on. I thought all that was important just because they go back with that experience, you know, and it just spreads the whole thing. So what I wanted to do was to encourage use of the island in several ways that had to do with our missions statement that we created. One was research. The other was education, environmental education in particular. And so we had classes that came over, and just from the University of Florida, this involved a lot of different departments or units, not just biology. So we had people from soil sciences, we had people from botany, we had people from the law school. I think I told you when Sandra Day O'Connor retired, she came over and she had a field trip. She's probably the most famous person we've had here. People in architecture come over and they do certain things. And so there's just been a real breadth. Entomology, I can name lots of units on campus that come over and have experiences here. So I wanted to continue with educational usages like that. And I viewed them very broadly. Then the other thing had to do with public education. So we would have a lot of high school or even grade school classes come over and just have an experience, maybe one day, or if they were old enough to stay over in the lighthouse, it'd be a weekend or something like that. We have Boy Scouts come, various youth groups, and there were a lot of training things where I forget the full name of one of these now, but there was a group that basically trained high school teachers in marine sciences. So they would come over and have training, things like that. And then we would try to have outreach events, like when they had we'd have an open house, usually in conjunction with the Cedar Key Food Festival, at least sometimes. And so the public would come over and we'd try to give them a show and a dance, you know, about what we do here, educational. So it was a public outreach thing. And then there was also environmental protection. We are here essentially as guests of the National Wildlife Refuge. And so everything that we do has to be within the umbrella of the goals of the wildlife refuge. Okay, so we can't just come and nilly-willy disturb the nesting birds and or catch a bunch of snakes and kill them and things like that. Every research project has to have a special use permit from the wildlife refuge. So I viewed all these activities very broadly, and there's a little bit of a catch-22 in it, and it relates to the resources and the administration. And this is what it is. When you come to know this place, one of the reasons it's unique and it's such a special experience is because of its relative isolation, and it's not crowded, you know. So the administration wants us to increase the usage so they can collect the fees and make money, right? So do things and make money and have more student hours generated and all that. But I always viewed that with a constraint, and that is you don't want so many people tromping around everywhere that they're going to frighten the nesting birds off, or somebody's going to be bitten by a cottonmouth, or they're going to screw up the vegetation, or they're going to mess up the beach, or it's just going to be so overwhelmed with people that a scientist that wants to do some research can't schedule a time to come over. So I always saw it as a field station. Actually, it's more of I regard this as a field station more than a marine laboratory, because it doesn't have a big modern facility that many marine labs do. Okay, but there are a lot of marine things that obviously you can do here. So Anyway, but it's a field station, and so what makes it special as a field station has constraints on numbers of people, numbers of activities, and so on. So I tried to play that balancing role, and it was sometimes difficult to convince the administration of the worth of that, you know. So that was another challenge. And when I became director, I can't remember the numbers. We did increase the usage somewhat, but one of my personal goals was to increase the usage for research, and not just everything being classes and generating student fees. So we had people that came from outside the state, various places, and did projects here. But there was a lot that needed attention, and I was just it's like plums on a tree, just coming to pick the fruit. So, for example, there's such a marvelous series of events that were taking place here, phenomena to do with the nesting birds, and I couldn't get many people interested. They just one of the problems, by the way, is if you're a student or a postdoc or even a faculty member on campus in Gainesville, and you decide you're going to do research out here, it's a commitment because you have to get here. So you have to make the drive and do the boat ride and so on, and so I think there are people who saw it as a potentially really neat research resource, but just couldn't commit. So that was a problem. But anyway, I try to get people interested in, there are a lot of marine things right around the shoreline that are of interest. We did have, Walter Judd had some students. He started on North Key, and the goal was, it still is, they're not quite finished, but they were doing a survey of all the plants they started on North Key, and then they've, I think, largely finished Seahorse, and then they're going to do Snake Key. And one of the early things that Walter told me his students were finding was, he said, we're finding a lot of tropicals that we didn't expect to be there. You find them in South Florida, but somehow they've gotten here, and they were new. They were surprised. And then there's a lot of dynamics that occur. Like if we have a hard freeze in the winter, a really hard one, a lot of the mangroves will die back, but then there's a dynamic where they return. There are 3 species of mangrove here, but the principal one is the black mangrove. And there are areas I can identify where, 10 years ago, they weren't there, or they weren't nearly as large. And then when storms come through, there's a lot of changes on the South Beach, on the sandy beach, and washing away the bluff and trees getting wiped out. And so the beach is always changing. And then I think, as everybody is aware of, 2 years ago, in the middle of the nesting season, birds had chicks or eggs in the nests, and then one night, overnight, the next day, all the birds abandoned their nests. And I don't want to go into the reasons. We have 2 good hypotheses of what the reason might be, but it was totally unexpected. And so, the departure of the nesting birds is changing the ecology of the island. Anytime, and there are a lot of studies about this in ecological literature, when you have somewhere like an island and you have outside resources that are brought in, usually by birds. Okay, so here, it's all the birds would, when they were nesting, would bring all these fish to feed their chicks, and a lot of them would fall down, and so, the snakes would eat them, and so the snake population grew, and that's a marvelous thing for me as a herpetologist. But also, when I was doing research here, I'd go over to North Key, I'd see a huge difference in other things, like we were counting bird nests one year, and so we had to make our way through all the hammock. We covered the whole island, and everywhere we were doing that, you know, we had to get spider webs out of the way. And we used to have a joke, it's like a person's worst nightmare, because you're walking through the hammock, there are mosquitoes everywhere, you have to watch that you don't step on a cottonmouth, and there's spiders everywhere, and then the birds are going to poop on you if you're under the nest. So we had some days that, in retrospect, were fun, but at the time it got to be a little bit challenging. But anyway, so the number, like the number of spiders here, probably the crab densities, there's a lot of things that made this island special, I think, because of the allothenous input from the birds. So I forgot the original question, but I was talking about increase in research. Yeah, so that was, you know, that was always a challenge, just get people to commit to a project and come here and do publishable science. But there was a lot of interest, and so this identifies another aspect of this problem, though. There'd be a group, say, that would come from, there was one group that came from Louisiana, from one of the colleges near New Orleans. And this guy came over every year. He'd bring a class, and they had an ichthyology class. They had a fish class. He would run the fish class, and then he would do research while he was here. But he was only here intermittently. And then there were other groups that would come, and they'd want to sample this or that. And so they would come. I'd make sure that we could accommodate them, and they would begin their work, and then they would leave. And then the problem is, we didn't have the resources in terms of a staff of people that could follow everything up and see what they were doing next, you know. So some people would come and then they wouldn't come back, and we didn't necessarily know, did they get the information they needed, or did they get halfway and then go off and do something else or whatever. So anyway, this is a really neat place for research. It's also kind of a challenge. But there are people who also use a research vessel to do offshore work, you know, so they're sampling offshore and work with invertebrates. Gustav Pauli and his students have used the place and so on. And then actually going back to the very early beginnings of this field station, Archie Carr, the famous sea turtle biologist, he used to come here, and I was told that he kept sea turtles in the marine tanks that we have under the pavilion down there, and he was doing some kind of research with the sea turtles. I wasn't sure what it was. So there have been lots of different uses like that. There have been, over the years, at least going back to Frank Matero and then through my years, there have been dozens of PhD and master's theses that have been generated by research here. There have been quite a number of publications. When Frank Matero was director, he used to, like some marine labs do, he used to number them and keep track of them. And so, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then he'd get up to some number. And so everybody that published a paper related to research, either supported by or done in connection with a marine lab, that would be identified and given a number. And I inherited that, but I just couldn't keep up with the numbers, you know, so I just decided that, well, we don't have to count everything, so, you know, just I kept a list and so on. So anyway, I would say that there was enough research productivity in terms of quality journal publications to give this place a reputation and standing among field stations. But because of its isolation, the unique thing it is, and requiring the boat transportation and everything, it's kind of a challenge to get people to commit to a real long-term project here. Jane Brockman, who we will interview, is is one of the exceptions. She's done long-term research on horseshoe crabs for many years, she and her students, and they've produced a lot of publications from that work.
You mention offshore work and the discovery, and I believe that you mentioned that you arranged for the purchase of the discovery. Is that true? Is that correct?
Well, it was kind of a gift. I negotiated that as that was one of the perks of my accepting directorship. So the dean of the college said, okay, we will buy you a new research vessel, which they had been pestered for 8 years or so. They knew that the older one is not operational, you need to replace it. And so when they changed the directorship, they decided they would commit that. And then there was some monies, I think, that went toward the seawall, but I got a match for it. So we were able to do the seawall on the dock as well. And we put up a new pavilion down there.
So did you select the discovery yourself, or how, could you briefly talk about how the discovery was chosen?
Okay.
If you know.
Just in sort of general terms.
Sure.
I myself am not a boat person, so I didn't have the expertise to be the one that decided, this is the boat we need. That was done largely by Henry Coulter, who was at the time our marine superintendent. So under me, he was in charge of the physical operations of the place. So I think Henry selected a boat. I approved it, of course. But, we sat down and we looked at, what are the requirements that we need or that we want this boat to be able to do. And so here's the boats he had looked at. And Henry knew, I think he's 4th generation Cedar Key person. And so he knows a lot of the people. He knows the boat people. And he knows people who even more so than him would have could offer a good opinion about, well, this is what you want to get. So that's the way it was done. I just approved it. And then we had a little boat party over here when we christened the boat.
What year was that?
That
Do you
was
remember?
Probably, so I became director in 1998. It was probably 99. It was pretty close around that time. That was one of the first things we did was to get the boat.
What was your goal for the discovery, or did you have one? Any specific tasks that you wanted it to perform?
Yes. We used to describe it as a floating laboratory. So the idea was that it could be used in 2 ways, primarily. One was for larger groups than we have here now. It provided transportation from the mainland, from Cedar Key to Seahorse Key. It also provided transportation to other places nearby, up or down the coast, or other islands. So transportation was one. The second one was the idea of a floating laboratory. So we had a lot of student groups or research groups that would use a discovery. Henry would take them somewhere, and they would do sampling, or they would have educational things like on the boat. So a lot of what we did was, a lot of high school groups in particular, a lot of student groups would come. They got on the boat for a couple hours, and they would dredge up the marine fauna, and they identify various things and say, oh, look, here's a puffer fish. I've never seen one of those before. What is it? And they talk about it. And they'd learn what a lot of marine invertebrates are and so on. So that was an educational thing. That would take place on the discovery. And so there were uses like that.
So you mentioned Henry Coulter, and I know in the research and with other interviews that I've done, folks have talked about the different caretakers throughout the years, and Henry was one of those.
Yeah.
And so could you talk a little bit about Henry's tenure as caretaker and what his duties were, and if you have any anecdotes you'd like to share about him?
Sure. Okay, so Henry, in my mind and memory, was always a wonderful person. You know, he is very knowledgeable. He knew everything you want to know about Cedar Key and this area, and he knew the waters really well. Actually, I will come back to that because that's a good story I can add. So Henry became, his job title was Marine Superintendent, and so he became Marine Superintendent in 1992. So he had done this about 7 years before I was hired. So Henry was the guy that, you know, worked under me and sort of took care of everything. And he worked closely with Alan Dinsmore, who at the time was, his title was Marine Mechanic. So anyway, what Henry basically functioned as more than anything was he oversaw the physical facilities, and importantly had a captain's license, and he could operate the boats, all of them, including the Discovery. I really viewed him as kind of like what a lot of people might call for field station manager, field station manager. Okay, so I just noticed I have stickly burrs on my leg there. I was picking them off. Okay, so Henry did all sorts of stuff for us, and he worked hard, and he worked overtime and worked on weekends sometimes, and there were periods when, you know, he would complain about the workload and so on, and he was doing over stuff, but he did it, and he was very accommodating. And I came over here when I did my research. Usually it was at night, so we'd come over, and if we didn't stay overnight and go to the expense of using the lighthouse and run the generator, we would come over. As I mentioned before, the snakes emerge at dark and they crawl around and do stuff, and that's what we were looking at. So we'd come over maybe in the afternoon. Henry sometimes would drop us off. He'd go back to the mainland. We'd usually come over in a skiff, smaller boat, because we had a small group. And then we would do our thing. And then there'd come a time to meet Henry. And we could hear the boat. And then at times, depending on where we were, we could see the light in the distance, and we knew that Henry was coming to pick us up. So the funny part was there were a lot of funny moments where one time we were up at Gardner Point. He was supposed to pick us up there. Except for using the dock, other places you could only get to if the tide was just right. So if we knew that and timed everything, we could get picked up other places. So some of those nights, like one in particular, it started to rain, and we got under a tree, and it was still about an hour before Henry was due, and then it would rain harder and harder and harder, so we got sopping wet, and then finally, you know, oh, there's Henry, thank goodness. Another time, I think we were at North Key. We were a different island. We were at North Key. We're doing stuff. We had a small group, and Henry came to pick us up, and the tide was such that we had to walk out to the boat. So we had to walk in water. There was one individual who complained about that, and he made the whole thing harder than it should have been. But we just, you know, we walked, but we ended up walking, actually, it got muddy, you know, and so we're pulling our feet out, one step at a time like that. And finally, with our lower third of our body covered with mud, you know, we get on the boat. Well, the thing was, though, Henry was absolutely reliable. He would be there when he said he would be there. And Al Dinsmore was the same way. And in fact, when I was, you know, kind of interested in learning about this at the beginning of these night trips with Henry, what he said about Al was, he said, if Al was, say Al's supposed to pick us up at 10 p.m. or something, he said, if Al is not there, he's dead. You know, he was, in other words, absolutely reliable. And so that was true. Sometimes, you know, they get a little bit delayed for some reason, but mostly it was very, very timely. And then the other thing was very important, and the reason that we did not use a little boat and come out ourselves is because at night, depending on the tide, you know, all the water around here, between here and Cedar Key, is very shallow. And so there are oyster bars and channels, and you have to have really good knowledge as well as boating skills to get back. And Henry could do that every time. We never had a problem getting stuck. There was one time we kind of got on an oyster bar a little bit. You know, we had to help pull the boat, or we got out and pushed. But generally, Henry and Al both had very good boating skills. And a couple of trips, he stopped because there was somebody with lesser skills in another small boat who had gotten stuck. And help, help, help. So Henry was always, he had a warm heart. He was always nice. So he'd say we're going to be a little bit late because I'm going to help these people and pull them out or whatever he had to do. So anyway, so Henry was, he was very competent at what he did. He was critical. He often complained about the budget, about the administration at the university, sometimes academics, because Henry is kind of a very practical person, you know, and he would see sometimes academics, you know, a professor with a group of students or something, who would ask him, well, let's take the discovery over here. And it would be a stupid request, you know. And Henry would shake his head and he says, I'm not taking you there because we will get stuck. You cannot go there. You'll ruin the engine of the whatever it was. So, you know, he had these opinions and things, and he shared them at times. And Al Dinsmore liked to talk a lot, and so you would get kind of a different perspective from these guys, but it was all in the spirit of being helpful and, you know, trying to run this place well. You know, Henry always thought that the university should have, you know, provided more money. And, you know, there were things we requested and didn't get funded that would have been a big help. Like, for example, where we used to have the dock for the Discovery, there was an empty lot that came up for sale. And I think the city ended up buying it. It is used for parking, but we could have purchased that and had a little kiosk that would check people in and out and could maybe provide certain types of things people might want to take to the island, and they could park there. So, you know, we tried to get the university to make the purchase, but they couldn't see the wisdom of it, and so it didn't happen. So things like that. So anyway, Henry was a lot of fun to work with. He got a little bit cranky toward his retirement. When he retired, you know, he's going to retire, he's going to be out of here. So, you know, he didn't put in quite the 150% that he would have before, but he put in the 100%. And, you know, I enjoyed working with him a lot.
What years was he working for the university in that capacity? He
became Marine Superintendent in 1992, and he retired about a year before I did, which was in 2012, so around 2011. So 10, 11 years maybe, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So 92 to maybe 2012?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And caretakers in the past had lived out here. Did he ever live out here, or he lived on the mainland?
No, not to my knowledge. He has a house that was well situated on the mainland, because actually there were times we had groups out here, and he had one sort of check on us that and he told us, you know, when sometimes before he retired at night, or he'd get up in the middle of the night, and he could see if certain lights were on, he knew we were okay and so on. And we had a radio, we could always call to the island. So anyway, it became impractical to keep up everything to have someone actually live here. As you know, there used to be other buildings, and some of the early, they were called caretakers, I think, at the time. Some of the earlier caretakers, I don't know much about them, but they lived here. So if there was more space, say another larger building other than the lighthouse and the laboratory, if we had a big facility, like a lot of marine labs, it'd be logical to have someone like Henry actually be on campus all the time. But because of the nature of this place, its historic status and being wilderness and everything, it's run a little more primitively. So as long as I've known, Henry, and probably the person before him, at least for part of the time, I think, came over but didn't actually have a residence here.
You mentioned Archie Carr. Did you ever know Archie?
Yeah.
Or meet him?
Yes.
Yeah, what was he like?
Oh, Archie was a lot of fun. He was all natural history and science. As you may know, he was an English major, so he liked writing. He wrote a number of books. He was also a good scientist, and he just loved sea turtles, and gave the world a lot of knowledge of sea turtles, and promoted their conservation. When I was hired, he was in the department, and I knew him for a number of years. I forget exactly when he passed away, I forget the year, but I knew him a number of years. And the first thing I learned about him was he often forgot names. So I remember one morning, I was in the department early. He was there. He was coming down the hallway in Bartram Hall. I was walking the other direction, and he comes and passes me, and he says, "Hello, Paco." So that was the name he picked because he didn't remember Paco. So I was Paco. The other thing I know about Archie was he was kind of a no-nonsense person. He didn't like to go to meetings and be in a public spotlight and do a lot of answering questions with people, or go to departmental meetings, when it's just going to be, a lot of stuff that doesn't go anywhere. So I think he was an excellent contributor to the department, but he had a really good focus on science and sea turtles and scholarly work, part of which was the writing that he did. And of course he had, his heart was to promote conservation of sea turtles. He did a great job. And he created the Sea Turtle Center. Yeah, so. And actually, I knew, Karen Bjorndal, who is the present director of the Sea Turtle Center, following Archie Carr, she was his student. And I remember many years ago, when I was at the University of Kansas, I was an editor for Herpetological Journal. And I remember it was at least one, maybe two. I remember a couple of papers. I remember sitting out on the lawn one day. I was reading one, and I'd gotten reviews. I was making a decision. It was Karen Bjorndal. So she had early interactions with me as an editor before I came to the department and actually became friends. Yeah, so yeah, Archie was great.
And you also discussed Charles Wharton and his work out here. Was there any other, were there any other items that you wanted to talk about with respect to him or his work, or any other anecdotes you'd like to share about him?
Okay. Probably anybody that knows about this island in connection with the snakes knows the name Charlie Wharton. And anybody that gets into the literature and studies cottonmouths anywhere comes up with, they know about the work of Charlie Wharton. So So Charlie Wharton did a PhD in zoology. He studied the cottonmouth here. That was his project. And he was a kind of a tall, lanky guy who became quite romanticized, partly because of mystery. You know, he's this tall, lanky guy that people could see walking the beach on the island, you know. He camped over here for a while. When he actually went to Gainesville and was at the university, I was told that he used to sleep in his car overnight, you know, because he didn't pay for an apartment or whatever. So he was he's a very outdoorsy guy. And there are a number of early magazine articles that were published about him and the fact that he was on this island doing some mysterious studies with these cottonmouths. And I have at least 3, there might be more, of these early Florida magazines that featured him on the cover. You know, one he's got a hat on, he's kind of standing on the beach, palm trees in the background, he's looking out. Another one, he's bent over doing something. But so anyway, there's quite a bit of romance about Charles Wharton. He published several papers from his PhD thesis, mainly to do with ecology and the reproduction of the cottonmouth. So he was the first one, and this is very important, he was the first one who talked about, with some first-hand knowledge, the relation between the colonial nesting birds and the cottonmouth snakes. And they were closely associated. Although I must add that actually before that, in the 1930s, Archie Carr became curious about these various rumors of all the cottonmouth snakes in the Cedar Keys. It was just the islands in general. And so he published an early paper in which he and 1 or 2 other friends or people, associates, came over. They camped overnight on Seahorse Key, and then they also went to Snake Key, and on both islands, you know, he described lots of cottonmouth snakes and that they were nearby to nesting birds. So those ideas kind of were at first folktale about this island. Then Archie Carr came over and confirmed, oh yes, there are a lot of cottonmouths, and you know, somehow they're related to the nesting birds. And then Charles Wharton was the first person that seriously studied the snakes and kind of expanded that information. And that was back in the 50s and 60s, and then, you know, then you have to fast forward to 98, 99 when I came, and my students continue to study the cottonmouth in various contexts.
And you had talked about a couple of unexpected species that you found on the island. Are there any other unexpected species, flora or fauna, that you found here that you did not expect, or any interactions that you had that you did not expect?
Okay. Let me just mention 2 or 3 things. The first one is the impact or the strength of the comment from Walter Judd about the plants that they found. They didn't expect to be here, and I don't know what those are. I have a list I can get, you know, but I'm not a botanist, so I just didn't remember them. But they found a lot of tropicals that they didn't expect, and some species that are not rare, and they nest around here. But when I first came, we're not nesting at Seahorse Key, but they started to nest later, and now they've left again. But anyways, roseate spoonbills. Those are kind of interesting birds. They show up at times, other times not. There are a lot of osprey on the island, and they nest here. But it's only occasionally that we see an eagle. And there's one tall tree on North Key where eagles nest. but then I remember there was one time we saw a pair of eagles flying above Seahorse Key. And let me see which way it was. There was some interaction where I think it was an osprey had a fish in its mouth. There was an osprey flying with a fish, and then one of the eagles was chasing the osprey, things like that. Okay, herbologically, the dominant snake population here is a cottonmouth. And they will eat other snakes. It's not their main diet, but they have a very generalist diet. And so because of that and the numbers, I think that the cottonmouths kind of keep the other snakes from establishing a population. At least that's one factor. So every once in a while, there'll be a snake we don't expect her that will. One time we saw eastern king snake that was still wet and it was climbing up the beach. It probably just had rafted over, swam over. The eastern diamondbacks don't have a population on the island, to my knowledge, but occasionally we would see one. So that was kind of a special event because they're not normally here. In terms of mammals, I think there was, there aren't large mammals on the island, but I think there was a time, this is a fuzzy memory now, but there was a time when I think there was a fox that was here for a while. And then it probably left, but for a short period it was a fox. One of the things that I didn't know about that kind of surprised me was there's a small frog from the Caribbean called a greenhouse frog. It's Lithrodactylus planarostris. It's a very small frog, and it's unusual in that it has direct development of its young. So eggs don't have to be laid in water, and so they can survive here because there's no permanent fresh water. So these little frogs, whenever I'd be over here and we'd have a rain, I'd notice these little frogs would be hopping around everywhere. And I suspect probably the baby cottonmouths probably feed on those. There seem to be a large number of those. But anyway, those are invasive. They probably got over here from the mainland. That's an invasive one. There's a small skink called a mole skink that's been found here. It's very rare. I never saw one, but it's on an endangered list, and they supposedly are on the island. Also, there's a lizard called mole lizard. Sorry. No, I've got the name entirely wrong. There's a burrowing lizard on the island that is rarely found, but sometimes after a storm or somebody does any excavating in the sand, you can find one of these. Worm lizard, not mole lizard. It's hung up on the skink, worm lizards. And they're about this long, and almost kind of pink in color. They dehydrate very quickly when they're not in a moist environment, so they basically they're fossorial, live in the sand. You rarely see those. I suspect they're probably here, but you almost never see one. Even if you come and do quite a bit of digging. I challenge you to do that. Come on, that could be a good project. Come over here, bring a friend and dig and see how many months or years it takes you to find me the worm lizard.
That's an excellent challenge.
That's about. Oh, I should mention gopher tortoises because this is not prime habitat for them because of the density of the hammock, but there are a few here. I know this because when we went all through the island counting the bird nests that one year, I found 2 or 3 active gopher tortoise burrows in a hammock. And there used to be one over here just on the edge of the volleyball court. I don't know if the holes are still there. They were also used by cottonmouths. They crawl in and out. But there was a tortoise, a gopher tortoise, an adult, that lived there, I surmise, because its burrow was there. But almost every day after the morning hours, there'd be a trackway. This used to be a volleyball court, and there was sand. It was nice sand. There'd be a trackway going this way. They come over here somewhere, and then going back. I never saw the tortoise, but we saw the tracks. We knew it was there. I think somebody saw it once, and we knew that's where the burrow was. So anyway, and I don't know if that tortoise is gone. I don't know if the other ones are gone. People almost never see one here, but there's evidence of their being here. So the bottom line is, I would guess that there are a few gopher tortoises on this island, maybe enough to maintain a small population, but not very many. And you almost never see them. So they are pretty rare as well. The other thing, I think the reason for your question, I mentioned we're publishing. We're in the middle of developing a manuscript that has to do with bird counts that we've made. So for 10 years or more, we've done bird counts every spring on North Key, Seahorse Key, and Snake Key. And during all those counts, which involved one or more persons who were bird people, not me, because they could look any bird or listen to any bird and they could identify it. So we kept all these. So over those years, there were some birds that are very rarely seen or were a surprise to the bird person. One, I think, was a scissortail flycatcher. But there were a couple of other ones who, which were here like out of season. You know, they're supposed to have gone. They were migrants, and they saw one here. I don't remember exactly what they were. Another bird that is somewhat rare, the pelicans that nest here are brown pelicans. White pelicans sometimes show up in the winter, and we can see flocks of them here and there. We used to see them sometimes on Seahorse Key, but that was a very rare event, and I've not seen them here for years, and I don't believe they nested here. You know, so with regard to the birds, I think Doug Levy told me once he would estimate that over the course of a year, if you count all of the migrant species, as well as residents and nesters, there's probably somewhat a little more than 140 species of birds that utilize this island. You know, and that's why I mentioned earlier, I'm just surprised there aren't more bird people that are dying to come over here and study the birds.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else that you would like to add, either about any of the topics that we covered, about your directorship or funding or species or your research or different people?
Well, I think we have covered it pretty well.
Okay.
I would just add that when I became director, as I said, I thought that it would be a good idea to have some research that I did here, because then I would be coming here more often. It would kind of help me plug into getting to know the place. So I'm very glad I did that. And the cottonmouths have been just an amazing thing to investigate. So I made, you know, many trips over here and back, some of them overnight. And sometimes several days. And some of these trips were strictly administrative. I'd come from administrative duties, reasons, or oversee projects, or interact with groups in terms of outreach, something like that. And then other trips were research trips. And when I made the research trips, that involved over the years numerous students, a couple of postdocs, and sometimes other faculty. And I'd just like to add that I made great friendships, and the funny stories are too numerous to go into. But Coleman Sheehy, who now has a position in the Museum of Natural History, Coleman is a person who was a master's student with me. He went elsewhere for his PhD. Then he was a postdoc with me for a while. And ever since I met him, we've been doing research together in one form or another. So I've had a lot of research experiences and field experiences with Coleman. And so he and I both have collective memories of all sorts of funny things. There was a graduate student who was here for a short while named David Wooten. And David Wooten and Coleman became very good friends. And they had come over and we'd do crazy things sometimes. David Wooten could play a didgeridoo. So we brought one over one time, and he sat over there on the steps of the lighthouse, and he did a didgeridoo concert and so on. And then we talked about how there are things to do with this island that a lot of people, might not put up with, like the venomous snakes, getting pooped on by the birds, or just other things. And there's also this myth of a headless horseman that rides the beach at night, all kinds of things like that. There's a lot of mystery about this place as well. And so I think it was David Wooten who came up with, he said we should call this the Hades, for hell, Hades biological station, because it can harm people in so many ways. So he had the Hades biological station. And then we'd get in the boat to go back after an evening of fun and research, and he'd say, okay, let's ride, boys, let's ride. And David had a great sense of humor, and so he was always making all these funny things about what we were doing and how crazy it was. And he said, he was quite serious, so we should name this the Hades biological station, put it on Facebook or some funny thing like that, which we never did. But so I'll tell you one story that involved me, and whenever Coleman remembers this story, I've heard him tell this to other people, and he laughs as hard as he did when it happened. And I think David Wooten was there also. So we were to the west, walking along the beach, doing work with cottonmouths, catching snakes and looking at them and measuring this and that. And so we were at this particular place where there are a couple of nesting trees, and sometimes what would happen is we would disturb the birds, and the pelicans in particular would fly away, and they go out over the water for a while, but then they would come back. And so there was a disturbed brown pelican that left its nest and started flying toward the beach. And I was bent over I think there was a snake in there. I was bent over, and there's a shrub here. And David and Coleman are watching this bird flying, this pelican, because it's coming toward the beach, but then all of a sudden like it starts to fall, like it doesn't have its height or something. Anyway, that bird came and it flew right into me, and it knocked me on the ground. And I'll tell you, a brown pelican is a large bird. I mean, that impact, it could have killed me. And frankly, and as a serious note, if it had hit my head or my neck, I think it could have broke my neck. but it kind of hit me on the back and on the shoulder, and I went down, the bird went down. David and Coleman say, wow, at first they're in shock, you know, are you okay? And then they start laughing, it's so darn funny. And then what subsequently happened was the bird, you know, flaps around on the ground for a while. And now it's trying to get airborne again. So I'm there, I'm totally in shock of the impact, and I'm trying to recover. And I look, and the pelican keeps flapping its wings, and it's on the ground. It's a large bird. It keeps coming toward me, and so I'm trying to back up and get out of the way. And finally, I don't know what happened. The pelican gets airborne and flies out over the water. But Coleman remembers that story, and he said it was so funny to them when they were watching where this pelican was going, and all of a sudden they realized, oh my God, it's going to hit Harvey right in the back, and sure enough, bam! So there were a lot of funny moments like that. Just one example. Yeah. So I had a lot of fun here, as well as very serious times in context of education and research.
Well, thank you, Harvey.
Okay.
I really appreciate you sharing.
You're welcome.